have to tell you that I've been doing this since I got out of prison, which is 35 years ago, traveling around the world, and it's a very heady business to come before an august gathering like this with some great theologians and clergy and leaders of the community, and it can go to your head. But God has a wonderful way of keeping me humble. A few years ago, my wife and I were up in Boothbay Harbor, Maine. It was sort of a foggy afternoon. We couldn't do much. So we were walking around the town. It was one of those old towns where there was just a central movie theater, with the old marquee outside and the billboards. And we thought, well, this is a good thing to do on a Saturday afternoon, foggy afternoon. We'll go and see the movie. So we walked through, we buy our tickets, we walk through, we come into the back of the theater. It was darkened, so we really couldn't see much. But we saw there were just about a dozen people. And they all turned around and looked as we got there and started applauding. And I thought, gee, this is something. You know Chuck Colson up here in Boothbay Harbor, Maine? I was surprised. And I sat down next to a person. I said, I didn't realize you'd recognize me here. He said, recognize you? Who are you? I said, I'm Chuck Colson. Isn't that what you were applauding when we came in? And he said, no, we were applauding because the manager had come out and said they wouldn't start the film until a few more people arrived. So, not only did God keep me humble with my grandson Max turning on the fans at the White House, but he has all kinds of ways of doing that. I have to tell you, I'm really especially glad to be here this morning. Now, that's not something I say at every speech, or if I do say it, I don't mean it like I do this morning. I'm here with my friend Dave Cowles, who I met in 1976 when I came here. Dave became a member of our board, has guided me throughout all these years of ministry. Dave is sitting over here. Many of you know him, a leader in the evangelical community here, faithful going into the prisons, and one of my very closest friends. So I was so glad to come and have dinner with him last evening and his lovely wife, Charlotte. And the reason I'm here is I received a call from Archbishop Sheehan. And he said, Mr. Colson, we're having a gathering in support of the Manhattan Declaration. There'll be Catholics, there'll be evangelicals, we're all going to come together. And that just warmed my heart. And he told me Michael Novak, at whose feet I have sat for years and years, learning my dearly loved, would be here as well. And I got a very packed schedule, but I said, Archbishop, I will do it. I'll come across the country because I think you're going to make history with this, and I think you are. I think you are sitting here today making history. God bless Bill Redmond, my friend for very many years, who went through our Centurion training program, who's deep in worldview. I told Bill as we were walking in, I said, I'll die a happy man if I could leave behind a few dozen people like you, because he really gets it, and he's done a beautiful job organizing, and all the evangelical pastors and all of the clergy that have joined in to make this morning what it is. You know what's really exciting about this? I recognize, and I hope you do, that if we don't hang together, we're going to hang separately. And the tragedy is, I was in the Marines in Korea, and I can remember, you never have anything to do with the Army unless the Army were on your flank and protecting you, and you're protecting them. We have all kinds of differences in the evangelical and Christian Catholic worlds and Orthodox. But there's a time when you stand together and make a united defense in liberty, life, merit. I'm also so thrilled that Oz Guinness and Jody Bottomer here, dear friends over the years, you've really got, those of you who are, I hope you'll stay all day, all of you, but it is a great lineup. I plan to be sitting here taking notes profusely, and it's a great lineup not only because of the substance of what you're going to hear, but because you are going to be part of the fulfillment of that high priestly prayer that Jesus prayed the night before he was crucified, that you heard read today. Father, may they be one with one another, so that as I am one with you, so the world will know you sent me. There can't be evangelism without that. We've got to stop this. We got to present to the world the scandal of the cross, not the scandal of our division. And so this is an historic opportunity for Christians to come together. Now, these are, to borrow a phrase from our founding era, these are serious times. This is no time for the happy clappies. This is time to get dead serious about the world in which we live. 65% of the American people think this country's on the wrong track. Rasmussen did a poll recently in which he found only 10% of the people believe the government cared about them. 53% said they don't. Now, stop and think about what this government was founded on. This government was founded on the consent of the governed, the idea that we would have representative democracy, the idea that our representatives would represent us. It would be a government for and of and by the people. And when people begin to feel disconnected from their government, you are in a very, very dangerous situation. You cannot govern. I know this having sat with the President of the United States for 4 years. You cannot govern without a moral consensus among the people. And that's been fractured today, and people feel it. And that's why there's this building fear, even anger, among so many Americans today. That's why the Congress is held in such low repute. Bill, you thought when you left Congress that you were stepping down. You were stepping up. I mean, used car salesmen have thought more than Congress. My goodness, that's dangerous. Just think what that does to freedom. Now, why is this? What's happened to us? What's gone wrong? I always say the world has been turned upside down, and I want to be about the business of turning it right side up. It started to be turned upside down in the last 100 years, but maybe mostly in the last 40 or 50. When the worldview by which we live changed. I'm so glad Bill has called this conference on worldview. I'm so glad that you're going to be studying and learning the things today you are, because we have a very truncated view of Christianity in America. We don't understand. It really is a worldview. It's how you see all of life. And worldview isn't some academic term that has to be explained by academicians. Worldview is simply the way you see life. How the world is organized. What are your basic presuppositions? What's your understanding of where we came from, why we're here, why there is sin and suffering, what our purpose is in life? And everybody has a worldview. And we live in a period today in which there's a fundamental clash of worldviews. Samuel Huntington, the great social scientist at Harvard, wrote a book about the clash of civilizations in the 90s. Everybody laughed at him, but he said the 20th century will be the time in which radical Islam confronts the West. And that is going on today. And these are two very alien worldviews. I'm not talking about Muslims and Islam. I'm talking about radical Islamo-fascists who've been taken over by a very alien ideology. Barbarism is what Michael Novak calls it, and it is. So we're clashing on that front, but we're also clashing in a clash for the heart and soul of our own culture, not something that we Christians brought upon ourselves, but something that was brought upon by aggressive secularists in the 60s who began to take prayer out of the public schools, who began to say we couldn't read our Bibles, who began to shrink religious liberties back in the 60s and 70s, and then, of course, Roe versus Wade, the worst decision the Supreme Court ever made because it stepped into a raging moral debate and thought it was going to settle it. It's raging even more today. But it is a battle between those who believe that society should be organized by a moral order which is revealed to us, which is available to us by reason and also by our understanding of what the Scripture teaches us, that there's a way that society ought to be lived. And people came and said, no, that's wrong. Friedrich Nietzsche, who may be the progenitor of what we call postmodernism, the age we live in today. Nietzsche once wrote, he said, you have your way, and I have my way, and as for the right way, it doesn't exist. This was the beginning of the deconstruction of our society. This was the beginning of the breakdown of our moral order. This is why we're living in an age today in which the Holy Father, Pope Benedict, calls it the dictatorship of relativism. The abandonment of truth, and the loss of Christian thinking, the loss of Christian influence in culture was never more evident than in the financial collapse of 2008, from which we are suffering today. 10% of our citizens are unemployed because of what happened when the bottom fell out of the financial markets. But what caused it, folks? Take a look at what really caused it. What really caused it was not a failure of commerce, it was a failure of ethics. It was a moral collapse. The government went about creating all these, the Community Reinvestment Act, they went all about this idea of pump all this money into the culture so everybody can have a home whether they can afford it or not. And they loved it because they created Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were these big, huge, multi-billion-dollar agencies from which the same senators who passed that and the same congressmen were getting campaign contributions. Just downright unethical. Well, all this money flooded into the culture and it went to Wall Street, and Wall Street is clever at one thing, making money, billions of dollars. So they came up with these credit default swaps and all of these fancy instruments which bundled together, they were able to sell all these new mortgages off to German banks and Swiss hedge funds without those banks and hedge funds ever realizing that those things had been rated by the rating agencies, I believe fraudulently, and that they weren't worth the paper they were written on. And they would have 100-to-1 bets on one transaction. And then what happened to lenders? Do you remember those era when every time you turn on the television, somebody wanted to loan you money? A friend of mine went in to borrow $250,000 to buy a home, and the mortgage banker said to him, "Take $500. We were trying to get money dumped out that we knew the people couldn't pay back. And what happened at the public level? What happened at the public level was that we abandoned the Christian ethic about work. We gave up on the concept of deferred gratification, which I was taught as a kid is a virtue. We gave up on the idea that we would postpone satisfaction to work hard now to make a better world for our kids. We gave up on that. We gave up on the idea that you don't borrow money that you can't repay. I remember my father used to tell me that always, don't go into debt. Well, we just decided the more debt, the better. The whole country went into debt. The public gave up on a Christian understanding of how we live our lives. And what happened? The whole house of cards collapsed. The loss of the work ethic, the loss of that which made this culture so great. And I've seen the same thing in the prisons. Over the last 35 years, I've gone into 800 prisons around the world, 600 prisons in America. When I went into prison, there was 239,000 people in prison. Today, there are 2.3 million in prison. And I'd go in, and Dave Cowell's with me, and we'd go in and start all these Bible studies everywhere, but we couldn't start them fast enough because they're building more prisons. So I went back and tried to study the causes of crime, and I read all the causes of crime through the sociologists for 200 years. They all said it was because of environment and poverty, and people sucked their thumb too long, dysfunctional childhoods. I mean, all this stuff. All this nonsense that took away individual responsibility, abandoned the Christian ethic about individuals being responsible. Along came a couple of Jewish psychiatrists in the mid-'70s. In the midst of all the studying I was doing, their names were Salmon and Colson. They discovered, and I just got Dr. Salmon on tape for an ethics series we just did at Princeton, and it's really amazing. Here he is, an Orthodox Jew. And he says the cause of crime is not what I thought it was. All those years I'd studied it, I thought it was environment and poverty and everything else. No, he said, it is people making wrong moral choices. Hello? And then he says, and listen to this comes from a Jew. He says the answer to crime is the conversion of the wrongdoer to a more responsible lifestyle. And then a few years after that, Professors Wilson and Herrnstein at Harvard discovered that the cause of crime is the lack of moral training during the morally formative years. Listen, culture, wake up. When we abandon the Christian ethic and the Christian understanding of how we live our lives together, we have moral chaos. We fill our prisons. We have kids who have no fathers, so they go to a male role model in the gang, and they end up in prison. That's the cause. What we're talking about today is the fundamental issue that determines the question how we live together as a society. It's not a partisan question. It is a moral question. It's how we decide to live our common lives together. Very definition by Aristotle of politics itself. So, what's our hope? All across the country, every place I travel, people say to me, well, all this anxiety we have about our country, I'll get straightened out in the elections this year. I heard it this morning. Now, I believe deeply that St. Augustine was right when he said, as Christians, we are called to be the very best of citizens because we're citizens of the kingdom of God living in the kingdom of man. So we do out of the love of God what others do only because they're required to do it. So we should be good citizens, which means you vote, you take part in the political process, you take part in rebuilding your community, you take part in reaching out to the poor people around you. You do all those things that your Bible commands you to do, your God wants you to do. But you don't put your ultimate trust in politics because it can't solve the problem, because politics is nothing but an expression of culture. There was a French theologian some years ago whose writings profoundly influenced me. His name was Jacques Ellul, and he wrote in the 60s. And what he said is, he wrote a book called The Political Illusion, after he wrote a book about propaganda and technology. And he was studying technology, and he could see that television was coming. And he was influenced by a Danish philosopher of a century earlier. This is an interesting little side note. The Danish philosopher's name was Søren Kierkegaard. Only lived 50 or so years, but in 1852, I think it was, he wrote this. He said, supposing someone someday would invent a giant talking tube by which you could address the whole nation at once. Surely the police would arrest him lest the populace became deranged. That's what's happened to us. The tube, we're connected by wire. Because what he said is everybody will then think all the solutions are going to be centrally given, when actually the way a society is shaped is how people live. It's not what happens in the places of power. But Ellul wrote this book, and he said eventually technology will wire into all the centers of power, and people will get an illusion that politics can solve their problems. And all it will do is give more and more power to the people in government, and eventually people will lose their freedoms. Oh, we should go back and think that through, folks, because that's exactly the position we are in. Look, the way the world works is simple. People are here with a belief system. Call it the cult, if you will. In the West, fortunately, we live in the most enlightened belief system in human history. That is the Judeo-Christian worldview. But that belief system, the cult, forms a culture. The habits, hearts, dispositions of people, how they live their lives, is formed by that. And politics is an expression of that. So if politics is sick, who's to blame? You and I. Because if we're the Christians, we aren't making a vibrant Christian witness which affects our culture, which in turn gives us wholesome politics and gives us people seeking justice and righteousness. Instead, they're doing self-interest. So if we're going to fix anything in this society, it's got to begin with us. It's got to begin with the Christian church getting very serious about what it means to be Christians and to live as Christians in the world. I'm devoting the rest of my life. I've been in the prisons now all these years, and I'm devoting whatever years God gives me now to try to teach people and train people and equip them to think Christianly about all of life, and then go into every area of life and defend it. You know, you heard Bill Redmond give a beautiful explanation today of the fact that Christianity is a worldview. It is. It's not just about you. It's not just about, I'm now saved and I'm going to sit in church the rest of my life. No. That's not what it is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. You all know those familiar words from the opening prologue of John, the Gospel according to St. John. St. John was a Greek. He used that word advisedly. We translate it in the English word, but what the Greek word was is logos. And what did logos mean? To the Greek, it meant all truth that could ever be known. So the Hebrews interpreted it as the mind of God himself. Therefore, Jesus is the author of all reality. And don't sell him down the river. Don't just say he's my Savior and my friend and I can get through life with him. No, he's calling you as exactly as he said, not only to go and make disciples, but to fulfill the cultural commission, to have a mandate over all of culture, to care for the animals, to name the animals rather, and to care for and till the soil, and to be responsible for the society that God has given us to live in, to be instruments of justice and righteousness. Abraham Kuyper, who had greatly influenced my life, was a theologian in Holland who interestingly enough, Kuyper was a theologian in Holland of the Reformed tradition. He would be called a hyper-Calvinist, if there are any of those here in Albuquerque. They're good people, it's all right. We sometimes call them the frozen chosen. But Kuyper formed an alliance with Roman Catholics, one of the first men to do it. And he said what I'm saying today, that if we don't join forces, we will be destroyed. And it caused a lot of controversy among the conservative evangelical circles, but Kuyper formed an alliance with, and he formed a political party, and he was elected Prime Minister of Holland. But when he started out at Free University in Amsterdam, he said this, in dedicating Free University, he said, "There is not 1 square inch in the whole domain of human existence as to which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry out, 'Mine.'" And I say to you as a church, if God calls out mine, if Christ calls out mine over all of the kingdom, then you and I have to cry out his and begin to bring his influence to bear in every single walk of life. We need to learn to live as Christians, to make an influence on the people around us, to do the things in culture so people will see that our way is a more excellent way for people to live, and that we bring help to the hurting and suffering people. And we need to defend, now not by banging our Bibles over people's heads, but by explaining in a winsome way why the things we believe so deeply are so important, not just to you and me, but to the culture around us, to the common good. That's what we need to do. And that's what we've done in the Manhattan Declaration. About over a year ago, I went to a man by the name of Timothy George, who's a great theologian at Beeson Divinity School, and I'd just been reading the Barmen Declaration. The Barmen Declaration was written by the German Confessing Church as they could see Hitler beginning to take more and more power. And they issued this beautiful Christ-centered document, which got every single one of the authors of it put in jail. That gives me little chills occasionally when I think about it. But the Barmen Declaration was a declaration that we will not be compromised. That's what it said. Our loyalty is to Christ. We will not be compromised. So I went to Timothy George and I said, "Timothy, maybe it's time for another Barmen Declaration." And he reached in his briefcase and pulled out 20 copies he brought for our board of directors at Prison Fellowship. He said, "I've been thinking the same thing." We got a hold of a wonderful scholar, Catholic brother at Princeton, Robbie George, and we started writing. And I can remember getting in touch with Michael Novak and sending it to him and getting comments back. And we came up with a 4,700-word document, and we didn't know what we were going to do with it, so we invited a lot of religious leaders to New York. They came from the Orthodox Church. Archbishop Dolan in New York came, Cardinal Regali in Philadelphia. It was amazing. A turnout, Al Mohler, some of the great leaders of the evangelical movement, Baptist leaders. We all came together, and Robbie and I sort of held this thing up, and we've said, we've written this, we don't really know how to get everybody to sign it. And before that morning was over, 65 people said, we're standing together. And that document was agreed upon, and lots of changes and iterations. We had a press conference in November. We didn't have any money or any resources because we were just doing this on our own. Actually, I was doing it out of my ministry. And we got up a makeshift website, and we announced it at a press conference. And it got picked up on television that week, and we had over 100,000 people sign this website. Now there have been 470,000 sign up. We want 1 million people to sign and say, we will stand in defense of life and marriage and liberty, and we won't compromise. So that's what brings us together today. And before this morning is over, and I'll be through in just a few minutes, but before I'm through with it, I'm going to challenge every single one of you to go back to your churches, get everybody in your church to sign that, spread it around the country. We have a Pray and Act campaign starting this fall, and we want to get 1 million signatures on the Manhattan Declaration, because then the world's going to sit up and take notice, and they're going to say, we got to defend these core truths. These are the threshold truths of the Christian faith as they're lived out in life. Life. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which didn't mean hedonism, it meant virtue, it meant living good lives. When I went into the Marine Corps, I was willing to give my life for that creed. That creed formed this country. That creed came directly from the scriptural revelation. The most radical doctrine ever introduced into Western civilization was when the Jews and Christians came out of Palestine and began to invade the Greco-Roman Empire. And they announced that human beings have dignity because they're made in the image of God. And it shattered the Greco-Roman Empire because they all had slaves. And they were all practicing infanticide and abortion. And along come this ragtag bunch of Christians out of the Jewish tradition, making this outlandish statement. And it revolutionized the Roman Empire and has revolutionized the world ever since. The greatest contribution of the Christian faith to the West and to the world is that it sets apart human life as dignity because it's created in the image of God. That brought an end to slavery. That brought women into the church. Right from the early days, the Christians were reformers. The first thing they did when they had the Didache, which was the first really discipleship manual of the church, was to declare that infanticide was an abomination and that abortion was wrong. That was the first issue the church grabbed on. In fact, in the 2nd century, Bishop Athenagoras wrote a letter to the Roman Emperor, Claudius Aurelius, denouncing Rome, not for sending Christians into the pit, into the lion's den, but for killing babies, which he called murder. That was the first challenge of the Roman Empire by the church. This isn't some new issue that Jerry Falwell came up with in recent years. This is the oldest issue the church has had to stand for. Human dignity, and it applies not only to unborn in the womb, and it applies not only to the embryo, and that's human life. Everybody in this room was an embryo once. And if you don't call it human life, where does human life begin? And somebody's going to tell you, no way. From natural conception to death, human life has natural death, has dignity. And that's important today, not only because of the abortion issue, but because it goes to the whole question of medical care. Who gets it, who doesn't? You want a utilitarian system which decides the greatest good for the greatest number? As Johnny Erickson Tada said, when the Nazis took over, the people that were most vulnerable and the first ones killed wasn't the Jews. The first ones killed were the people with infirmities, handicapped, invalids, because they can't produce anything for society. Do you want your life judged by what you can produce for society or by the fact that you have an innate, inherent dignity given to you by God? Listen, folks, eugenics is back. Those of you who have read your history books know that eugenics, we blame it on the Nazis, but it didn't. It started in America, in the fashionable salons of New York and Philadelphia. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most esteemed jurists in our country's history, issued the infamous Buck decision in which he had a black woman sterilized because she was the third generation, and he said, who had mental infirmities, and he said, 3 imbeciles in one family is enough. This is scary stuff, and it's upon us today. I know it's an inflammatory term to say death panels, but somebody is going to make a decision with shrinking medical resources and burgeoning budgets. Somebody's going to make a decision who gets medical care. God help us. The life issue is central. And it's what drove me into prisons all these years. All the folks say, well, that's social justice. No, social justice arises out of my concern for the dignity of every single human being, including the prisoners. And marriage is the underpinnings of society, has been, of every civilized society. And I was telling some of the guys ahead of time, I'm going to go on a campaign. I'm going to say, stop talking about same-sex marriage, because that's an oxymoron. Marriage itself means the union of one woman and one man, the physical union for the propagation of children. Same-sex marriage is a bogus term. You can't have marriage with the same sex. I mean, as Rick Warren said one night on Larry King, when Larry King said, "Are you against same-sex marriage?" And he said, "Well, sure." And Larry looked stunned, and he thought Rick, who was then in meteoric rise, would say something more political than that. And Rick said, "Of course he did." And Larry said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, I tell you what, stand up a naked man and a naked woman together, and you'll see why." Larry King was speechless. It's true. My concern for the poor and everything about life stems out of my belief in the dignity of human beings who were made in the image of God, and after God made them, what's the second thing he did? Joined them as one flesh for the propagation of children. And marriage is all about children, not about how well or happy we might be in that relationship with that spouse. It's about the kids. And if we don't understand that, we're going to lose the future generations. This battle, which is going on in California right now, let me tell you, it's coming at us like a freight train. And that judge ruled in California, in overturning Proposition 8, the will of the people, he ruled that marriage is a fundamental right. How can you say such a thing? It can't be a fundamental right if you're not capable of fulfilling what marriage is about, which is children, by natural procreation. Can't be. And that's going to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, the most liberal circuit in America, where undoubtedly that decision will be upheld. And it will come to the Supreme Court. And let me give you a warning today. We've got to do our job. Believe me, it's urgent we do our job. Because the Supreme Court, and I did my honors course in law school in constitutional law. I have little idea what I'm talking about. Robbie George is a great constitutional scholar. Hadley Arcus, many others have said the same thing. The Supreme Court over the years seldom steps into a raging political debate. We saw them get into the abortion issue, and many of the justices now regret they did it because that issue, they didn't settle it. But they redefined liberty to be anything you choose it to be, defining the meaning of the universe for yourself. All these wild phrases. Well, what happened? The assisted suicide case came out of the state of Washington in 1997. The right of assisted suicide was declared a constitutional right by the Ninth Circuit, the same one that's going to hear this marriage case. And they held it was a constitutional right, and it went to the Supreme Court. And guess what happened? They used all the language of the abortion decisions. Any lawyer looking at that, as I did, would have to say they're going to have to grant assisted suicide as a constitutional right. But something happened. The public opinion polls showed that people were against it. And on the day that the Supreme Court was being heard, the case was being heard in the Supreme Court, people with disabilities came with signs and paraded on the steps of the Supreme Court saying, "We're not dead yet." 9-0. 9-0. The Supreme Court ruled, led by Justice Rehnquist, ruled that it would not take that case while there was a raging public debate. So what's going to happen to gay marriage? It's going to go to the Supreme Court, and they're going to make a decision, and it's all going to depend on how much noise you and I can make and how much public stir we can make over this issue, because that's what the Supreme Court will do. They read the newspapers, believe me. And if we do our job and that becomes a burning issue, we will not have this thrust down our throats. If we fail, if we get it, it's because we weren't making the noise to be heard. And the final thing we say in the Manhattan Declaration is that religious liberty is an inherent right of all human beings. I remember when I went to the Soviet Union to negotiate for the release of Soviet Jews in 1973, Nixon sent me over there at a very delicate moment in the negotiations, and I remember being with Vasily Kuznetsov, the chief Soviet negotiator, and I kept saying to him, he said, Mr. Colson, you're interfering. We had all the Russians on one side, all the Americans on one side of the table, and in the Kremlin, and he said, you're interfering in our domestic affairs. I said, no, we're not. Because the Jews wanted to leave and they couldn't get out of Russia. They weren't letting them out. So We went there to make a case to release them. And I was sent because I was the political guy, and this was a political issue in the Congress at the time, holding up the strategic arms agreements because there was a rider on one of the bills that they had to release the Jews first. So I'm there saying, he's saying it's a domestic issue and you're interfering in a domestic issue. No. I gave him by heart the words of the Declaration of Independence. I said, we see human rights coming from God, and human liberty is part of the natural condition of human beings. It's the way we're made. We're given a free will. Augustine talked about that. We're given a free will, which means we're made in God's image, which means we have freedom as our basic nature, and that can't be taken away or given by a government. I eventually got 35,000 Jews released in those next weeks because he gave in on that point. But we can never compromise that point, ever, ever. And it's happening to us today. I'll just give you one illustration. We all know the court cases and that dreadful case, the Hastings case where a Christian legal society was told it had to hire homosexuals or be banned on the campus. We're going to face this, folks. And any pastor in this hall right now, I'll tell you, within 2 years with the hate crimes laws that have been passed, somebody's going to come into your church and saying, you are preaching homosexuality is a sin, you can't do that. We're going to face it. We're going to be put to the test. It isn't a question of whether we will be, it's just a matter of when. But that steamroller is coming at us as well. Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, gave a speech at Georgetown University last November. Jody Bottom carried it in First Things. It didn't really get much of a stir, and I got it up on my website about a month ago, and it went viral, and we had 174,000 visits to the site. Basically, what Hillary Clinton said was, here her words, very close. I'm paraphrasing because I don't want to memorize it, but I'm paraphrasing. Human beings have universal human rights to organize together for their government. They have the universal human right of freedom of worship. They have the universal human right to love others in any way they choose. Gay rights has been elevated to the same level as the right to worship, but the right to worship, what are we talking about? Our founders said Congress shall make no law with respect to the free exercise of religion. They had freedom of worship in the Soviet Union. It was in their constitution. But the pastor who came out of that church and said anything about public affairs or anything about what was going on in life was thrown in jail. Our Chinese brethren will tell you that in the state church in China today, they got freedom of worship, but they don't have freedom of religion because they can't take their religious practices into life. And what we are now being told, and the State Department's issued a document which says those two terms are interchangeable. They are not interchangeable. That is playing with words. That's committing verbicide, as C.S. Lewis put it. That is saying, that's the Ministry of Truth, which is issuing propaganda. That's newspeak. Folks, listen, don't fall for that, and you better alert all of your friends that this is happening today in the United States government. The President of the United States has used it in 4 speeches. Now, why does he do this? Because it appeases Islam. Islam will never grant freedom of religion to anybody, but they will grant freedom of worship. They want to be able to worship the way they see fit, but not the religious freedom of other people to do it. So it was an attempt to appease Islam. He was advised after his Cairo speech that he used the term freedom of religion, and it would not sit well with Muslims. So that's why it started in the State Department. But the implications for us in America are profound. If we ever reduce freedom of religion, free exercise of our faith in every walk of life, simply to the act of worship, which is private, sit in your churches, don't bother us in the rest of society, if we ever do that, we are finished. This is the time to take a stand. The Manhattan Declaration, in 4,700 words, makes a compelling case. It is presented winsomely. We express great sympathy and understanding of people who are caught in alternate lifestyles, but we can't condone something that would undermine basic institution of marriage. We will fight for life at every single level, whether it's the poor man on the street who needs help, or whether it's the person who's making a decision about whether he can have medical help to stay alive. we will never compromise our religious freedom. We say in this document, in the closing words of this document, we will render to Caesar ungrudgingly what belongs to Caesar. But we will never, under any circumstances, render to Caesar what belongs to God. And we'll take our stand, whatever that means. I hope all of you will stay for the whole day, because there's some of the great speakers in the Christian world who have come here, like me, most of them from across the country, in order to educate you on what it means to have a biblical worldview. How vitally important that is. And thinking Christianly about all of life. And folks, I don't want to be melodramatic, and I don't want to be a false prophet, but I got to tell you, I think we are at the Armageddon of the culture war. I think if we lose this case coming out of California, and if God perish the thought, freedom of religion is ever reduced to freedom of worship, we've lost the battle. And I'm a former Marine. I don't know what retreat or defeat means. I'm going to keep fighting. And I want every single one of you to go from here today and get all of your friends to sign that document. And don't just sign it. Start educating yourself. Read it. I've said to everybody, don't just sign the Manhattan Declaration. They think, well, I've done one on this website. I signed it. No, read it. Learn how to defend life, marriage, and liberty with your neighbors and friends in a winsome way. And I do believe in the sovereignty of God. Despair is a sin. The end is never going to come until God brings the curtain down on his play, his creation. And in the meantime, all he wants us to do is to do our duty. Go today out of gratitude to God and do your duty to him. God bless you.